Thank you, Julianne. Our speaker today is Annisa Karim, who grew up in southeastern coast of Florida and graduated from the University of Florida with a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife ecology and conservation. She then worked as a naturalist for the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, helping to develop curricula for the Florida Master Naturalist Program before returning to UF for a Master's of Science degree in wildlife ecology and conservation. She now is the operations manager for the Florida Museum Randall Research Center, which you're going to hear more about. It's now celebrating its 25th anniversary. The center is the largest tract of pristine coastal pineland and mangrove swamp in the heart of what was once the second largest town of the Calusa people. And she's here today to tell us more about these powerful and socially complex people. The title of her talk is Knowing the Calusa, Turning Anthropology on Its Ear. So please welcome Annisa Karim.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out to listen to a talk about archaeology. For a lot of people, archaeology is not a living science, but I hope today through my talk and hopefully through our question answer that we can start to realize that archaeology is in fact is a living science, and how much we can learn about our current world based on the people of the past. So hello to everybody on Zoom and hello to everybody in the room today. And we can go ahead and get started. So my talk this morning is titled Turning Anthropology on Its Ear. When we as humans go into any endeavor, we come into that endeavor with preconceived notions. That's human nature. If you see a person walking down the road every day and every day they make the same right, your preconceived notion will be the next time they do that, they will make a right? We as humans take in data and we try to figure out what is happening in the world around us. But that doesn't always work. We have to continue to learn about the world around us and start to understand that more things could be happening. So we'll talk about anthropology and archaeology today and how the study of the Calusa actually did turn anthropology and archaeology on its ear. When I went to school here in Florida as a fourth grade student and I learned about indigenous people, I learned that Juan Ponce de Leon discovered Florida, right? As if there was nothing else here, as if it was untouched. And I think a lot of people have heard that history, have heard that narrative that Juan Ponce de Leon discovered Florida as if there was nothing here. But actually at the time, I'm just trying. At the time, there were likely over 100,000 people in the state of Florida in the 1500s when Juan Ponce de Leon came. And not just the Calusa, not just the Tequesta, but people from all over Florida. They lived in the interior. They lived along the coast. It is really difficult for archaeologists to start to understand what their cultures may have been like. But one of the things that we do know is that as we started to get people that are discovering the new world, right, trying to take over and subsume these cultures, those people, the Spanish, the English, the French, they actually had with them people on their ships that were taking notes, basically transcribing what was happening, transcribing their interactions. And of course, those interactions come with biases as well, but we start to learn a lot about the cultures of these people. The Calusa were, in fact, a very powerful indigenous group. They lived in Southwest Florida from about Charlotte Harbor, if you can picture where that might be, to about the 10,000 islands. But their sphere of influence actually was much more magnified than that. But we can't really talk about the Calusa and how much we know about them without talking about Don and Pat Randell and their incredibly generous gift that they gave to the University of Florida Foundation. So in the late 60s, Colonel Don Randell and his wife, Patricia Crandon Randell, they moved to Southwest Florida to Pineland, which is in Lee County. And they purchased a number of acres, and they started off with something like 50 acres, but they kept buying a little more land, and they knew what they had in their backyard because of their education and their quite frankly, their ability not to have to take down these mounds to build roads or use them as fill. They knew that they had a treasure in their backyard, but they weren't going to themselves discover those treasures. They understood that they needed professionals to come and do that. There's an article in our local newspaper in Southwest Florida from 1983 where someone asks them, what are you going to do with those mounds in your backyard, these indigenous mounds that were in their backyard? And they said, we're not going to dig there. We hope to have a professional do that someday. So they were committed not only to finding out about what was on their property, but to make sure that it was done in the proper way, to make sure that archaeologists and anthropologists were able to come to their home and basically find out what was in those mounds. Now, Indian mounds, mounds left by indigenous people, that is not unique to the Calusa. We see that all over Florida. In fact, we've seen that in other countries. We've seen that in other parts of this country, right? So that was not unique. But learning what was in those mounds, that really is what they wanted to know. And so Don and Pat Randell were very generous, not only with their time, but they did eventually become aware that for this legacy, for this work to continue beyond just their stay on Pine Island, that they would have to kind of create a place for this work to happen. And so they actually donated land to the University of Florida Foundation so we could have an archaeological research center there. And this aerial shot just next to their pictures, this is actually Randell Research Center. This is the public trail. We call it the Calusa Heritage Trail. This is the public-facing part of the Randell Research Center, so people can learn about the archaeology that was done in the past and learn about upcoming things as well, meeting archaeologists in person, meeting wildlife ecologists, learning about the history, the ecology, and the archaeology. And so Randell Research Center is a program of the Florida Museum of Natural History. You know that this series is about not all of, but some of what the Florida Museum does. And so the Florida Museum, just like the University of Florida, may be headquartered here in Gainesville, but stretches throughout the globe. The collaborations, the science that is done, certainly the people that come to Gainesville, come from all over the world. But the Randell Research Center in Southwest Florida is also part of the Florida Museum of Natural History. It is part of the South Florida Archaeology and Ethnography section. And so we have actually been doing digs in Pineland since 1988. And in fact, in 1989, the University of Florida sponsored something called the Year of the Indian, where thousands of school children from Lee County were able to come and see a dig in process at the University of Florida's Randell Research Center. I love this story of our logo. This is our logo. You'll see it on our hats and our buttons and pins and things when you visit Randell. I hope you visit Randell. But when you look at the logo, it's a really interesting story. If you look at that artifact just above it, that is a picture of a bone that was found on site in 1995. The bone itself is only about an inch long. It's very small, but it is an exquisitely carved and etched bone. And this really shows us it's a crane. We believe it to be a crane. And because we found it on property, we found it next to, we found it, it was still part of the Randell's property before they gifted it to the University of Florida. It was on Randell Mound. So we adopted that as our logo, but it really went to show that the Calusa went far beyond just subsistence living. It was far beyond just food, water, shelter. When you go beyond that as a society, you can start to express yourself in art. You can start to be and become a greater community, a powerful society. And so this was just a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of insight into how the Calusa did. They had time to spend on art. We enrich ourselves through music, through art, and likely the Calusa did as well, but this is evidence that they did. You don't need a bone fragment. If you're starving, you don't need to sit down and take the time to etch a bone fragment. But when you have a community that is working together, that is feeding everybody is clothed as you might be clothed back then you can start to express yourself. So this is really an important find, not only the fact that it was there, but it really gave us insight that the Calusa were, in fact, people more advanced than just what we thought they were. So at Randall Research Center, we really focus on three major things. We focus on archaeology, we focus on history, and we focus on ecology. It is the ecology of Southwest Florida, the estuarine environment, that actually enabled the Calusa to be so powerful and so societally complex without practicing agrarian agriculture. So when I went to school, I was told for any sort of community to be advanced or complex, they had to be agrarian people. They had to plant things. They had to harvest. The Calusa did harvest, but they didn't harvest from the land. They harvested from the estuary. And because estuaries are so biologically productive, they were actually able to sustain thousands and thousands of people without planting much. They did have plants. They had small home gardens. They planted papaya and chili pepper seeds, but they didn't have huge crops like we would imagine an indigenous group of people might have had, right? So we're going down to Pine Island now, and you will notice that there might be a mistake on this map. Can anyone point out where there might be a mistake? It kind of looks like a mistake to us. Well, right here, is that Tampa right there? Well, it really was Tampa, to be honest. We're the ones that were mistaken after the 1700s. This is actually where Tampa was placed on maps. And so that was the original Tampa. Pineland was Tampa. And you can see this influx of fresh water from the Mayaca River, from the Charlotte Harbor. You can see the Caloosahatchee River emptying into here. And so Pine Island Sound, this entire area was protected. It was not fresh like the rivers. It was not salty like the Gulf. It was in between. It was brackish water. It's protected by all of these barrier islands. So the intensity of the waves certainly is not great. It is somewhat shallow. So there's a lot of gradients from fresh to salt water as you move through the estuary. And that, for aquatic creatures and aquatic plants, is incredibly important, because that is the environment, that is the exact environment that they need to be successful as fish, as crabs, as seagrasses, right? And so it is that kind of convergence of this type of biological system, this estuary that is so productive, that where the Calusa were able to make their homes, and make their homes quite successfully. You will see another area on this map, Fort Myers Beach. That is a place where we know that the Calusa lived. But right here, Mound Key, that is the capital of the Calusa Nation, as we call it. That is where the Calusa's chief lived. Their chieftain was there. And then Big Mound Key is another big island or another big homestead of the Calusa. This is Randall Research Center. This is one of the mounds. This is actually Brown's Complex Mound 1 right here. And if we look at the radiocarbon dates, there are dates in here that go to 600 AD. And the top of the mound right about here was formed in the 1700s. So we know that the Calusa were here building this mound. We know that it took them hundreds of years, and likely they didn't build it just to live on top of it. They probably lived on it as time went on. Their end goal probably wasn't, hey, we want a 3-story mound. They probably lived on it and built as they needed to. And that's really how societies work, right? Your innovation comes when you need it, hopefully, and then you live like that for a little while, and then innovation continues. And so on the top of Brown's Complex Mound 1, if you visit the Randall Research Center, you will see this sign, this illustration that's on that on the top, on our interpretive sign. We call this the top of the world. And this really is an incredible informative piece, because this is kind of what we believe the Calusa used to live like. There was a lot of iconography. There were headdresses. There were headdresses. There were necklaces. There was some religious ceremonies. There's certainly a cross-island canal. The Calusa actually built a canal all the way across Pine Island, which stretched over 2.5 miles. Incredible engineering feat if you consider that there was no Home Depot or Lowe's, there was no hard metal, there was no hard stone. It was all done by shell and handwork. So the shells that you find on the beach when you go to the beach, the lightning whelks, the conch shells, that is what they use, combined with sticks and twigs and branches of trees to put together to build tools to build this cross-island canal. There were certainly people that took advantage of and became very skillful in aquatic environments, so they did have dugout canoes, and they had these mounds. And at this point, you're probably thinking, well, how do we know that's what it looked like? I mean, we weren't there. There weren't any records. So how do we know? And so we actually have multiple lines of evidence. There was an expedition in 1895 and 1896. Frank Hamilton Cushing came from the Smithsonian, and he was told that on Marco Island, there were a number of artifacts kind of just bubbling up out of the mud. And these artifacts needed to be collected. They needed to be recorded for all time, right? So Frank Hamilton Cushing in late 1895 decides he will make his way down to Marco Island via water. And so, of course, we're not close to Marco Island here, but he had to stop here to switch transportation. And so when he was here, he actually slugged through the estuary, the very shallow, mucky estuary, and he found Pineland. He found Tampa, right? And when he went to Tampa, he actually saw these mounds, and he had the time to actually map out what was there. So it didn't look exactly like this. I will stop doing that. It didn't look exactly like this when he was there, but there were certainly mounds there. There were certainly a lot more of the canal there than we have today. And so he sat down and he figured out how many mounds there were, how many mounds he could see, and he created a map for us in his journal before he went down to Marco Island. And so we know that there are a lot of mounds on Pineland. We also know that at that time, the census said that there were about 35 or 36 people living there. The 1900 census tells us that were not very many settlers there. So we believe that what he drew, what he mapped out in 1895 is probably pretty accurate to what the Calusa left behind. That's not the only line of evidence we have, though. We have those writings from the Spanish boats that they were taking notes. They were taking notes about their interactions with the Calusa. And so we know that there were mounds. We know that these ceremonies happened on mounds. We knew that there was a cross-island canal. There was a young man that was shipwrecked. And when he was 13 years old, he actually started living with the Calusa. He was a Spanish child of the age of 13, and the Calusa, for some reason, actually allowed him to live with them for 17 years. And he actually wrote memoirs as well. So we have these multiple lines of evidence that tell us what Pineland looked like. And so this was the top of the world. This was the top of the mound where you could look out and see this cross-island canal. You can see these multiple mounds. And so the Calusa had this sphere of influence in Southwest Florida that went all the way to the East Coast. They were trading with fishermen. They knew what was happening with Columbus was coming, and they had slave ships, and they were taking indigenous people as slaves. The Calusa already knew what was coming. They knew that Spanish ships meant war, and they knew that Spanish ships meant potential slavery of their people. And obviously they didn't want that, right? So the Calusa were ready when the Spanish came. And so when Ponce de Leon came and made a 230-day journey to Florida, he went first to the East Coast and eventually ended up on the West Coast. And we know that the Calusa were ready because they were in contact with Spanish fishermen who told them what was happening. And so when he arrived, the Calusa were ready. And so they left Tampa with their canoes, and they left Mound Key with their canoes, and they confronted Juan Ponce de Leon. And at first, the Spanish believed this to be a potentially friendly interaction. But very quickly, they learned it was not a friendly interaction. We're talking about an area that's extremely shallow. So big Spanish ships couldn't make it all the way to these Calusa towns, right? but the Calusa could make it offshore. And so they came with canoes and they came with weapons to stave off the Spanish. So if you're on a Spanish boat and you are taking notes, you are transcribing the interactions, you might actually say that the Calusa were a fierce, warlike people, right? Because that is what your interactions with the Calusa are at the time. Juan Ponce de Leon came twice to Pineland, once in 1513, the next in 1521. And in 1521, he was actually fatally injured. He was able to leave, but then died later on. So that is what happened to Juan Ponce de Leon. But we know by the journal left by the young Spanish man that lived with the Calusa that, yeah, I mean, they were warlike when they had to be, but their daily life did not necessarily include contentious interactions all the time. They created a community where they were able to sustain themselves on basically the fishery that they found. There were canoes that they dug out with their tools that they created through their shell tools. They made nets. We've actually found remnants in wet digs, remnants of nets that they used to actually catch fish. So when we find these mounds, what you'll see initially is really the remnants of what the Calusa left behind, right? Obviously, the organic material deteriorates. It is decomposed and goes away, but the inorganic material, the shells, they're left, right? You still have fish bones. You still have some artifact of potentially what was there. So these middens were basically trash heaps, but they actually lived on them as well. So if you're on the coast of Florida and you need to get away from storm surge, you want to get away from the bugs, you want to see who's coming down the estuary potentially, being high and dry is really a benefit. And so to build these mounds was a benefit to the Calusa. And they didn't just build one or two. There are multiple mounds that used to exist. And so as we start to dig in these mounds, these excavations tell us a lot about how the Calusa lived. On your right is a picture of one of our former colleagues, Karen Walker. She is now retired happily, but Karen was in this excavation. Karen is a little bit taller than me, and you can tell how far down she is. You can see that ladder. And what she's doing is she's very systematically drawing a profile and documenting what she's seeing. On first glance, what you see basically are shells, right? So we talk about what a shell can tell us. As a wildlife ecologist, I think about what contemporary wildlife tells us. You know, we know the mineral content or the kind of the thickness of the shell, but if you look in the past, you might actually see those things change. It might be the same species, but you might see that the shell wall was a little thicker. You might see that the animal was able to actually get larger, or maybe didn't have enough nutrients to get that large. So what we find in these mounds really informs us of what the environment was like when these shells were taken. And it also tells us how they were able to use these shells as tools. They definitely were able to use these shells to manipulate the environment around them, but that's what humans do. Actually, that's what a lot of animals do, right? They manipulate the environment around us. You think about alligators or architects of the swamp. We've heard this. We know that woodpeckers create nest cavities, and we know owls do that. So animals manipulate the environment, but the Calusa were able to do it in a really, really effective way with the very limited amount of tools, the limited amount of materials that they had. So they definitely had canoes. They definitely used their environment to benefit them in terms of food, water, and shelter. And as scientists, what we can also determine is what the environment was like. And so if we're in a dig, if we're excavating a lot of oyster shells, we bring in other people from other diverse professions, and we ask, well, what does a crested oyster tell us about the environment versus an eastern oyster? If we get to a section where we see a lot of crested oysters, we know that perhaps that was a time of greater salinity, and perhaps it was either a drought that caused this salinity, or maybe they were just actually collecting closer to the Gulf, right? And the opposite is true for the eastern oyster. Lower salinities is when eastern oysters are most productive. So they're both oysters, right? An oyster is an oyster. Well, Not necessarily. The eastern oyster actually is able to thrive in lower salinities. The crested oyster is selected out. And so this could point to either times of heavy rains or potentially that they're far away from the Gulf. They're collecting these in more freshwater environments. So when you look at one of these mounds, the first thing you see are these shells, these gastropods, these lightning whelks. But the closer you look, the more likely you are to see fish bones. Of course, fish bones are a lot smaller, so easily overlooked. But once you start trying to figure out what is actually in a 1 meter plot, you find that there are a lot more fish bones than there are shells. They actually relied more heavily on fish than they did on shells to live. And why do you think that might be? I mean, for those of you who fish, is it easier to catch enough fish to feed your family or collect enough shells and the meat in the shell? Probably fish, right? If you have the ability to make hook and line, if you have the ability to make these seine nets to catch fish, how many of you have ever used a seine net or a gill net before? Are any fishermen? Okay, so when you use a net, do you usually catch more than one fish? Right, you do, right? And so the potential for catching much more is there with those types of technologies. Instead of combing the floor of the estuary looking for these large conch shells. So fish were actually a larger part of the diet. But then again, you bring in the ichthyologists, tell us about these bones that we're finding, right? And so we find that spotted sea trout live their juvenile years inshore. So if we are finding bones of very young spotted sea trout, we know they probably caught them inshore. But once they get over about 4 or 5 inches, they start to move offshore, and you cannot catch them with a net. A lot of the fish bones that we find in these mounds are bones of fish you cannot catch with a net. So intuitively, you think there must have been another way. It was probably hook and line, and that is what we find. But then there are also other things like mullet that, potentially you can catch with just a net. So the type, not only the fact that we're finding fish, but the types of fish inform us on how they were actually able to sustain thousands of people in their communities. So we see kind of a complete picture of the Calusa. If you look at this picture, you can see canoes, you can see nets, you can see the variety of potentially their buffet, right? This is what they eat. But you needed people in the community that were able to make those nets. You needed people in the community that were able to make those canoes. You needed people that were able to fish. And so the community, the Calusa, like many communities, had to have their people that were experts in what they did, and then allow, if I'm an expert net maker, I make my net, and I hand my net to the expert fisher person who will then go and catch the fish. So that's how the Calusa were able to be so successful. And we know from what we found, not only in Southwest Florida, but all over the country, that the Calusa actually had these huge trading routes. We have lightning whelks from the Gulf Coast of Florida. Lightning whelks are showing up in other parts of the country, even showing up in Canada. And we have things like galena and quartz crystals showing up in Southwest Florida. So we knew that the indigenous people had these trade routes, which makes total sense because you can't really live in a state without running into another indigenous tribe, right? So they had these trade routes. They had these actual fortified relationships with these other indigenous people that allowed them to know what was happening, but also trade. So this is a picture of Mound Key, what we believe Mound Key might have looked like. When the governor of Florida, Aviles, came here, the Spanish-appointed governor of Florida came here, he talked about a large house where thousands or hundreds of people could stand inside. We know that the Calusa built these huge shelters, and we know that they actually they were using these shelters to create not only space to live, but these large buildings were for religious ceremonies. And so we have had excavations on Mound Key. We've done ground penetrating radar and have actually found a fort that used to be there in the late 1500s. And of course, being an advanced society, the Calusa did create their own deities. They had three deities, one that ruled the heavens, the second that helped with government, and the third that helped with war. And so this burial mound is this illustration, and a lot of these illustrations that you're seeing that I'm using today, they are actually illustrations that we have on museum quality interpretive signs at the Randell Research Center on the Calusa Heritage Trail. But if you look at this, it really signifies how much iconography there is and how much ceremony there is surrounding the burial of the dead. And that is not necessarily unlike what other human cultures do either. We have seen pictures of or are in fact part of cultures that have multiple ceremonies around burying someone that has died or people that have died. So it is not uncommon to have ceremonies, right, surrounding the dead. But the Calusa actually had burial mounds where they buried their dead. And so this speaks to the fact that they were able to get above that food, water, shelter space and start to not only express themselves in art, but start to create ceremonies and create religion. Now, you remember that I spoke about a gentleman named Frank Hamilton Cushing, right? He actually mapped out Pineland and kind of helped us discover what Pineland used to be in the late 1895. He was on his way to Marco Island, if you remember my talking about that. Well, he got to Marco Island and he found some amazing artifacts. Actually, they were bubbling up out of the mud. It was a time where the water level was coming up, and what had been buried in the muck, they were unearthing. Unfortunately, as soon as those of you who know, if something is preserved in an anaerobic state, a state without oxygen, what happens when it hits oxygen? It's gone, right? Pretty much, or quickly gone. So that's actually what they found as well. They figured that out rather quickly. As they were unearthing these artifacts, they were starting to deteriorate, but they had someone with them that could sketch, and they were sketching the masks and the tablets, but there were some artifacts that were pretty well preserved. One of them was this turtle beak head. It's another example of this iconography, this other example that they had time to express what they were feeling or what was happening in art. This one on the bottom right is the Key Marco cat that you might have heard of. There is a book that is out now, The 9 Lives of the Key Marco Cat. It came out last year. Austin Bell, he is the curator of the museum on Marco Island. He wrote that book, and we're actually happy to have him at Randell Research Center. He's coming in February. But so the Key Marco cat was an example of how they created these images of half man and half panther, how they saw themselves in the ecological world. But this centerpiece of art, this is something that was unexpected. You can see fairly clearly that is a shell with the etching of a human being on the inside, right? And so when Frank Hamilton Cushing started to find all of these artifacts, he tried to preserve as many of them as he could, and he took them back to the Smithsonian. When he took them back to the Smithsonian, he was actually accused of forgery because they said, how could these savages actually represent themselves in art? That doesn't happen. The indigenous community, the Indians, the savages cannot do that. And so he was accused of forgery, and he actually had to defend himself and say, no, I actually found that there. And eventually he was exonerated. But these preconceived notions that even early scientists had about the capabilities of the indigenous people that lived here actually prevented us from understanding how complex they could be, right? We have this idea that you must have an agrarian society to be complex. But with the work that we've been able to do on Pineland, we have found quite quickly that the Calusa of Southwest Florida were the most complex and powerful society in Southwest Florida. And they relied for protein not on agriculture, but on aquatic resources. This was the first time that it had been acknowledged that people could be advanced and politically complex without the invent of agriculture. Bill Marquardt is he is a famous archaeologist, a famous Calusa, archaeologist, and he was the former director of the Randall Research Center. He is now retired, but this was something, a statement that he made that was quite profound, because it does go to show that, you know, you have to acknowledge what your preconceived notions are and set them aside if you want to enhance your knowledge of a society. And so we know now that the sophistication and the fierceness of the Calusa allow them to be some of the most powerful people in Southwest Florida. And they were actually never subsumed by the Spanish. They were never overtaken by the Spanish, as so many other cultures were. And so we continue to learn more and more about the Calusa. We continue to learn more and more, not only about the Calusa, but their interactions with the Spanish. The current director of the Randall Research Center is here with us today, Dr. Charlie Cobb, and he does some amazing work that talks about how the Spanish and the Calusa interacted and what that might have looked like on Pineland. And so it's really exciting to be able to take something that we know already happened and start to gain even more information about the Calusa. So the Randall Research Center is actually a pretty unique part of the museum. We do, like the museum, rely on donations, but we have a public-facing outdoor trail. The Calusa Heritage Trail is really meant to educate people about not only about the Calusa, but also about the archaeology and the history and the ecology of Southwest Florida. It is a unique site that enables people to walk on the mounds of indigenous people, learn about them, learn about some of the ecology of the area, and we have some amazing docents. So if ever you want to take a trip down, give me a call. I'll be happy to arrange a fantastic tour for you. If you are going to be in Southwest Florida anyway, it's really worth the trip out, and I would encourage you to come. And I'd love to see you there. And that is us. We are the Randall Research Center, part of the Florida Museum of Archaeology, Natural History, sorry. And through the work that has been done there, we've actually been able to move not only the science of archaeology forward, but also kind of rethink the preconceived notions that we had of indigenous people, and perhaps, hopefully, start to look with a brand new eye on the past. So thank you very much, and I'm willing to take questions if anybody has questions. Thank you, everybody on Zoom.
Question.
Thank you very much. That was really a good talk and very interesting, and we can learn a lot. It looked like on your last slide that there was a lighthouse in the picture near the mound, and I'm wondering what that actually was.
Would you mind calling the, let's take a look together. I think I know what you're talking about.
Keep going.
One more, this one, right? So I believe that this is so it's an artist's depiction of what might have been happening. We see a lot of canoes in the water, probably some religious ceremony, and what my interpretation is that this might be the mast of a sailing ship in the distance. There is no evidence of a lighthouse or anything of that sort, anything that is incredibly, or any kind of a fortress or a tower or anything like that the Calusa had. So it is an artist's rendition, and every time I look at this, I think, well, maybe there's a religious ceremony happening, or maybe there is a Spanish ship with the sails down in the distance. So unfortunately, I cannot answer that question. But all of these images were created for the Florida Museum by Merrill Clark. And so he has a few books out and I'm happy to, if you have your contact information, I'm happy to contact him and see if he might have an answer for what that might have represented. Sure.
We have a question here on Zoom.
All right.
Ms. Ryan, go ahead.
Is there any evidence that the Calusa ate birds?
Yes, there is evidence that the Calusa ate birds. Actually, the gumbo limbo tree that some of you might be familiar with, you saw it in that picture of Brown's Mound Complex 1. There was a person kind of with their back kind of looking over their shoulder, and there was a large tree. So that is a gumbo limbo tree. They actually use the gumbo limbo, not only the Calusa, but a lot of indigenous people use the gumbo limbo to capture birds. They would kind of shave off the top of the branch. The sap is very sticky. The birds would light. The birds would stay there. They actually traded red cardinals with Cuban fishermen. But when it was very cold, the Vandel minimum, we know that the Calusa had to rely on eating migratory ducks when it became really cold. When a lot of these aquatic, we're talking about tropical Southwest Florida. You have tropical, the gumbo limbo is part of a tropical series of plants that we find in tropical hardwood hammocks. So it's a warm place, right? But when it gets extremely cold for a few hundred years, you have to rely on something else. You either move or you change your diet, and potentially both. So they actually did rely heavily on migratory ducks. When ducks were migrating through, we have evidence that they were eating ducks. We believe that they probably took advantage of the fauna, not only fish and shellfish. That was a majority. We do find bones of other birds. Excuse me. We do find bones of other birds. In fact, we find bones of inland animals as well, not as frequently, but we do. There was another animal called the Florida monk seal that they relied on as well. It is now extinct, but we did actually have a seal in Florida. And so they relied on the meat of that seal as well.
Okay, any questions from our audience here? Behind you, Mr. Axe.
The Calusa and many Indian tribes used a lot of color and painting on their bodies. Did they have tattoos already in those days, or what did they use? Do you know?
I don't know. I am still learning and reading a lot about the Calusa, so if I'm able to come back in 5 years, I might have an answer.
Come on back.
I don't think there were any tattoos. We do know that they used body paint a lot for ceremonies. We know that they created the dyes from native plants that occur in Southwest Florida, so they certainly had dyes and paints that they used a lot. But there is no evidence that I have seen of tattoos, of permanent markings.
John, oh. I see you, Pushpa. Don't worry. We'll get you.
Were they also trading with Mexicans, Mayans, Aztecs, etc.? They're going and the people that were living the
I don't believe their trade routes took them that far, kind of directly. I believe that their trade routes, from what I have read so far, their trade routes would take them maybe halfway, right? Not across the Gulf, but up over to the north, and then going west towards Louisiana and up, but not all the way to Mexico. I don't believe, and I've not seen that in any literature. So I don't believe they went all the way there. You know, one of the things though, I am a purist when it comes to native plants, and I try and convince my friends and family they have to plant native plants. And when I first started learning about native plants, my thought was, well, papayas are not native. They shouldn't be here. But that's another thing. It's turned botany on its ear, because we found papaya seeds that were over 1,800 years old in one of these wet digs. So the Calusa did have papaya. How did that papaya get to the Calusa? Did they bring it? We don't know. We don't know how it got there, if there was a trade route involved. So it's possible that there was some connection, right, to the Yucatan Peninsula or Mexico or Central or South America, but I don't know exactly how those types of things got to the Calusa, how they were able to take advantage of them. But there's no evidence that they directly traded with Mexico.
When I hear of mounds for archaeology, can you hear me?
I can.
I always think of finding burial mounds.
Yeah.
So were there any burial mounds? And secondly, if not burial mounds, were they like trash mounds, the things that they discarded that kind of collected, like we have our trash dumps?
Right, yeah. We humans haven't changed a lot when it comes to landfills, right? So there were actually two distinct types of mounds. The burial mounds were made mostly of sand. We actually have a burial mound at the Randall Research Center. It is composed primarily of sand. And so we don't allow people to walk on the burial mound because it is an important site for Indigenous people. There's a path around the bottom of it, but when you look on it, you see native plants have grown up, and you see the substrate is sand. And that is what we believe is the entire substrate. They used to bury their dead in sand, but the mounds that they lived on were their trash mounds. Those middens that were full of shells and full of fish bones were also full of discarded food. But, they probably didn't have a lot of leftover food. They had small home gardens, and some of them, and it's not likely that all of them lived on a mound. Some of them, and they did have a class system, right? So some of them didn't live on a mound. But as we go through these mounds, we see layers of sand and layers of charcoal where we know or we believe that they did live on those layers, and then they would build some more and live on top. So those refuse heaps, those landfills were what they lived on. These middens, these discarded shells, that is what they lived on. But they did have distinct other mounds that were burial mounds, for sure. Yes, and that is not unique to the Calusa, right? A lot of Indigenous groups do that. So yes, you're correct. Hi.
There is a mound and an archaeological study in Crystal River. Did the Calusa come that far north, or is that a different group?
That's a different group, but we know that the Calusa did trade with them. I went to the Crystal River archaeological site last year, and I talked to the rangers there. So it's not believed that was the Calusa, maybe the Tocobago, but not the Calusa. That's a little far north from where they would have been. But they did definitely trade with them. The Calusa had a huge sphere of influence, and there are a lot of things we find in other areas that are Calusa, maybe Calusa specific, and then vice versa. We find things like galena and quartz crystals and things in Southwest Florida that would never have been there naturally. But we don't believe that area is Calusa. You're welcome.
While we're waiting for that question, there's a chat that says, please post title, author of the book on Calusa cats.
Sure.
So you can send that to me, and I'm happy to send that out.
I'll be happy to do that, yes.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Wilshire.
Thank you for your presentation. They had quite a sophisticated area there. Could you comment about the impact of their diet on the size of the Calusas?
Sure.
And how long they lived there and what caused their demise?
I'll be happy to do that. So one of the things that the Spanish said about the Calusa is that they are giants. And so that's something actually that we hear quite a bit. What does giant mean? How big were they? So giant meant 5'8". And for us, that's not so giant, right? But when the Spanish were there, the Spanish men were about 5'4". And so that to them, they're looking at someone that's 4 inches, maybe even taller. Maybe, the average was 5'8". So certainly their warriors might have been the taller ones. So maybe they were 6 foot tall. Their diet consisted almost entirely of protein. So they were probably pretty well built. They were probably pretty muscular and pretty intimidating. So we don't know. I haven't read anything about their lifespan, how long an individual would live. But their demise came actually when a lot of Indigenous groups were subsumed, right? It wasn't necessarily the war, it was the disease that got them. So a lot of Calusa were susceptible to and fell prey to disease. But at the end, it was when Spain and England kind of decided England would have Florida, it was the English that pushed the Calusa south. And if you know of, or if you are a person of faith, you know that religion is very important to people, right? People that believe, it's very important to them. The Calusa, their deities, it was very important to them. They really were rejecting, or they were trying to not be converted into another religion. And so the idea was, hey, if you want to be saved, literally, you will have to be baptized. You will have to go and be baptized. And so for the very few Calusa, they all got pushed down into the Keys. And so a few of the Calusa agreed that they would be baptized. About 200 were able to take passage on a boat and go to Cuba. And they were to be baptized. So there were maybe 1,000 or so Calusa left in the Keys. The ones that were able to go were baptized. The ones that stayed did not survive. The ones that did make it to Cuba, their record disappears very quickly as well. So we have no definitive answer to what happened to the last Calusa, but we do not believe that we have any Calusa. I mean, certainly there could be some DNA around, right? But we don't believe there's a Calusa person around. The Seminole tribe that lives in South Florida now, I've listened to some oral histories, and the Seminole tribe, they have this thing, they used to call them the fishing Indians. The Calusa were called the Fisher Kings by a lot of people. And so you might hear a Seminole person say, oh yeah, my grandmother was married to a fishing Indian. And so that, we believe, meant Calusa, a surviving Calusa somehow, but there's no evidence that they are really any Calusa left. So it happened in the 1700s, and it happened because the English were pushing them south and trying to baptize them, convert them.
No further questions?
Thank you so much. I have one last comment. I do encourage you to come to Randell, but I understand for some of you it's not it's a long drive. I know. So I do have some newsletters here for you to look at. I encourage you to go to our website. The history of the Randell Research Center is really interesting. Not only the Calusa, but how the Randell Research Center was formed and all of the community support behind it. It's a very special place. And you can learn more about Randell Research Center on our website. And if you look at past newsletters, you certainly will gain some insight into how this work continues. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you again, Annisa. I want to say a few words about next week's, what we plan for next week. Originally, the talk next week was to be by Dr. John Brock, talking about the extinction of the dinosaurs. But we were informed yesterday that there was a death in his family that was going to prevent him from speaking at that time. So we're working with our museum coordinator, the wonderful Brittany Snipes, to see if we can move our last speaker, Dr. Blackburn, who was going to talk about frogs, to next week, and hopefully we can then reschedule the dinosaur talk for the final week. But failing that, we will have to just have a 5-week rather than a 6-week series of lectures. So we'll keep you posted on what's going to happen next week. And thank you very much for coming. And we hope to see you next week.